Well, first of all, most importantly, China really worries that the United States seeks to acquire nuclear primacy over China. In other words, acquiring a capability to conduct disarming first strike capability against China. And the best way to reassure China is for the United States to clearly accept a mutual vulnerability relationship with China, or in other words, to explicitly accept mutually assured destruction relationship with China. The Obama administration came very close to that by explicitly committing to maintaining bilateral strategic stability relationship with China. But it didn't openly and clearly say mutually assured destruction or mutual vulnerability relationship. And the Trump administration actually went one step backward by refusing to commit to bilateral strategic stability relationship with China. So that again raises Chinese concern about U.S. commitment to not deliberately attacking Chinese nuclear assets. So some form of political reassurance that the United States would not seek to deliberately undermine Chinese second strike capability would be very helpful. Secondly, I think U.S. really needs to seriously address the challenges to bilateral nuclear stability from new non-nuclear military technologies, especially missile defense and conventional precision strike weapons. China very much fears that these non-nuclear military technologies can very much contribute to American disarming first strike potential against China. And therefore, China has already been modernizing its nuclear programs in order to counter such threats from non-nuclear military technologies. And given the deep bilateral distrust, it's very hard for China to avoid using worst-case scenario thinking in assessing the impact of American non-nuclear technology on China's small nuclear arsenal, and therefore it requires long-standing and substantive bilateral engagement to help the two sides bridge their gap in understanding the impact of such non-nuclear technologies.
China has very long been concerned about the survivability of its nuclear forces, and historically that was primarily about a preemptive nuclear first strike from the US. Now, however, China is growing increasingly concerned about US conventional strike capabilities, coupled very importantly with advances in US intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. And the Chinese fear basically is that the US could locate its mobile missiles and then could destroy those with precision conventional weapons. Secondly, China is concerned about ballistic missile defenses. And the concern there is that if the US were to strike first and get most of China's nuclear forces, but not all of China's nuclear forces, then the few that might remain could be mopped up by US ballistic missile defenses. And the kind of nightmare China scenario is the combination of a conventional preemptive first strike coupled with US ballistic missile defenses being able to mop up whatever couldn't be got by the first strike. And the point that Chinese analysts there make is that essentially this would allow the US to disarm China without crossing the nuclear threshold, which they view as being more credible than crossing the nuclear threshold. Let me say two things in general terms. Personally, I think this fear is strongly overstated. I think that the US is and will remain for the indefinite future incapable of destroying China's nuclear forces with non-nuclear capabilities. But it's very clear that Chinese analysts and experts largely don't agree with me. They honestly believe that their nuclear forces are under threat. And so important to deterrence, to strategic stability, is this perceptual dimension. So even though I don't agree that China's nuclear forces are under serious threat from the United States and advanced US conventional capabilities, the Chinese perception that they are is one that I think it's very important to take seriously.
If China reads the United States as being resolved through its consistent actions or consistent statements and very clear red lines, it's less likely to escalate. So there are two examples that I can cite. So the first one is the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident. So China reads U.S. actions or past statements with regard to the Scarborough Shoal as being relatively vague, which leaves China room for using coercion, for example, gray zone coercion, even if it's not escalating to military coercion, because the U.S. statements when it comes to the Scarborough Shoal per se is that the U.S.-Philippine Defense Treaty covers the Philippine territory, but the United States or the Pacific, but the United States never clarifies whether Scarborough Shoal is in or out of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So that leaves a little bit of a vague loophole for China to take opportunity of. But when in 2016, I think President Obama was quite clear about the red line in terms of not reclaiming islands on the Scarborough Shoal, and that would be a red line, and China actually took it quite seriously and never reclaimed the rock, which is the Scarborough Shoal. So when I asked or interviewed some of the Chinese former diplomats, and they all believe or think that it's partially because of U.S. statements and a more clear red line. So another negative example is that in the 1990s, one might be surprised, but China actually uses military coercion more in the South China Sea. So one example is the 1994 and 5 militarized seizure of the Mischief Reef, which is also claimed by the Philippines. So China used military coercion right then because, well, one particular reason is that the United States actually withdrew its troops from the Subic Bay in the Philippines beginning 1992. And from a lot of the interviews and internal documents that I've gathered, it's clear that China watched U.S. actions very clearly and interpreted U.S. withdrawal from the Subic Bay as an interpretation that the United States is not as committed in Southeast Asia, and therefore used military coercion. So the number one source of strategic instability or stability, I would say, actually has to do with how the United States act and sort of talk about and make statements about a particular issue at hand.
There are a number of sources of instability within the relationship, and I think perhaps primary amongst them is the conventional military balance, and the way that China's buildup of conventional military capabilities is changing the way that the United States needs to think about its military presence in the Western Pacific and about how it would conduct any future military operations, obviously with important implications for how it defends or cooperates with its allies in East Asia. And I think one of the difficulties there also is that it does prompt consideration of whether the United States needs to think about, perhaps threatening or at least letting China know that the nuclear option would be on the table in a conventional conflict between the two countries. So I think that's definitely a concerning source of instability. A second source of instability, I think, is technological competition between the two countries. So China has for a long time played catch up in terms of important military technologies, and it's reaching a place where it's investing in some of the new technologies that may have military applications at a similar pace to the United States. And so this is another, I think, source of instability, of not knowing where that technology is going to lead them, and either of those two countries gaining an edge. A third source of instability, I think, is just a lack of knowledge in both countries about what what aspects of the relationship entail competition and what are just the normal relationships. So trying to figure out if investment in another country is truly a signal or a part of a broader competition between the two countries, or whether this is just what companies do to try to enrich themselves. So not quite understanding how one another is choosing to compete in their emerging great power competition, I think, is another source of instability. And one perhaps that I have focused a lot of attention on is the lack of acknowledgement and understanding of inadvertent escalation pressures within China, I think, is another important source of instability within the relationship that's going to require some attention to make sure that Chinese decision makers and operators are fully aware or think through some of the unintended consequences of taking certain actions, not just with their nuclear weapons, but with a whole host of military capabilities.